Text here from Robin Barking.
Discuss all of this is Cormac Smith, who better, a former advisor to the Ukrainian Foreign Ministry. Cormac, first of all, let's talk about this second drone attack on the Black Sea vessel in the last 24 hours after a Russian tanker was hit. Is this an uptick in sort of deserved retaliation by Ukraine? Is this the right way forward in this conflict? Could things spiral out of control, or is this necessary for them to really fight back and defend the territory?
Alex, good afternoon. Could I start by quoting Vasyl Malyuk, who is the head of the Ukrainian Security Services, the SBU, who said only yesterday that this is an absolutely logical and effective way to regard the enemy. Now, this was an attack in Ukrainian territorial waters. Crimea is, according to international law, part of Ukraine. It was illegally annexed by Russia in 2014. The point I would like to make here is Crimea is the absolute critical arena of this war. An awful lot of people in the international community thinking taking back Crimea is a step too far. I can tell you, having lived among the Ukrainians and worked at the heart of their government for 2 years, Ukraine will never give up on Crimea. As long as Russia holds the Crimean Peninsula, one, Ukraine will never be safe or secure. It's like a dagger into Ukraine's belly. But also, holding the Crimean Peninsula, Russia controls the Black Sea, and with it, the vital Black Sea ports, which are critical to the viability of Ukraine's economy, and we're seeing the effect of this with the attempted Russian blockade. So yes, I think it's an absolutely clear and logical and important point, legal under international law. Way for Ukraine to progress.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you brought that up because, of course, it brings to mind the fact that Russia themselves have been bombing grain storage facilities, and this is grain that is desperately needed by the developing world to stop countries being plunged into starvation and famine, and perhaps very cynically doing this to control maritime routes, but also essentially drag the rest of the world into this crisis. 40 countries meeting today in Saudi Arabia. How warm do you think their sentiments are towards Russia right now? I mean, is it the fact that Putin is very cynically creating a whole lot of leverage because he knows there are certain countries, and of course he sent his Wagner attack dogs into places like Sudan, places like Niger. How warmly do you think they're thinking about Moscow right now? Because a while ago, it seemed to me that people didn't really want to get involved in it, sort of, abstain from votes in the UN and said, well, we still need to buy Russian gas and oil. We still need to side with Putin because our own economies depend on it. Surely the tide is changing now that people can see quite how ruthlessly Putin is acting.
Well, Alex, I hope the tide is changing, but it's important to recognize that traditionally the BRICS countries, and the BRICS for viewers is Brazil, Russia, China, India and South Africa. So that group of countries, the four outside Russia, have been traditionally quite warmly disposed towards Russia. But also, I've got to say, probably the majority of countries on the African continent, for a variety of reasons, have been well disposed towards Russia, not least for the fact that back in the colonial days, when they were fighting to free themselves from colonialism, we had the USSR, and it was very, very often the USSR who were backing the countries who were fighting for their freedom. So, but Putin's Russia is a very, very different animal to the USSR. But as you quite rightly point out, these grains that Ukraine exports, some of the poorest countries on earth, including many in the African continent, depend on those. So, there is a huge threat of starvation, but also forcing millions of starving people into forced migration, possibly into European countries, which would further destabilize European countries, which is all in the Kremlin's playbook. So I hope, as you say, that that these countries may be thinking again and may be starting to look less favorably on Moscow and the Kremlin. But it is really too early to say. We need to keep watching very, very closely on that one.
I mean, this is, of course, I agree with you entirely, this is Russia's playbook. It seems to me that with the aid of China, they are intent on controlling maritime routes. And I'm glad you mentioned South Africa, because a while ago, they seemed all up in it with Russia, holding joint naval exercises, of course, and Iran as well, when it comes to controlling territorial waters and international waters north of Africa. How difficult is this going to get globally? We're not in a global hot war yet, but with all intents and purposes, what is going on now is directly impacting countries around the world, whether it's a shortage of food, whether it's an energy crisis around the world. The war going on in Ukraine is touching so many countries right now. How close are we to this tipping over the edge and becoming something really quite frightening?
Well, let me say two things, Alex. And one, it's, you talked about you talked at the start of our interview with Russia bombing the grain storage. It was quite, I had a wry smile 2 weeks ago when Russia hit a massive grain storage facility in Odessa and destroyed 60,000 tons of grain that were destined for where? For China. Now, I don't think that particular action will have done what they call a no limits relationship any good. And we are seeing signs, certainly at the moment, that China seems to be pulling back. They're certainly not giving Russia the full level of support and armaments that Russia would want. On to the second part of your question about how dangerous it is that this will tip over into a greater global conflagration. I always like to quote Alexei Reznikov, who is Ukraine's Minister for Defense, who went on CNN, it was about the 23rd of December 2021. That was almost 2 months before the further invasion happened. And he said very clearly, we don't want or expect your boots on the ground. Give us the weapons we need and we will do our own fighting. Now, unfortunately, we have been giving the Ukrainians the weapons that they need too slow, too little and too late. The Brits, I've got to say, have been leading the charge from the very, very start, starting with the vital lightweight anti-tank weapons. It was the Brits this year who unlocked the logjam with the modern battle tanks when we provided them with 14 Challengers. It was the Brits who really started to unlock the logjam with the long-range artillery when we provided them with Storm Shadow. But they are now having to prosecute a counter-offensive, still without air cover or air superiority, because the long-awaited F-16s, which Joe Biden has finally relented on, are still not in their hands. And my latest information, we even have still not started training the Ukrainian pilots. They don't have a lot of the long-range artillery that they need. Germany recently decided, a long-range artillery called Taurus, Germany decided that the Ukrainians didn't need this. Germany, who hasn't had to fight a war in 80 years, is telling Ukraine, who are in the teeth of a war, what they need and what they don't need. And of course, America still needs to provide ATACMS, which is another long-range system. And these long-range artillery is absolutely critical, not to allow Ukraine to attack the Russian mainland, but to allow Ukraine attack elements of the logistics chain and ammunition depots far behind the front lines. And that's going to be very, very important coming back to Ukraine's attack on Crimea.
Yeah.
So I think it's not about, this is affecting the whole world.
It is.
And, I, as a friend of Ukraine, say we must support Ukraine because genocide has been committed.
Well,
but I also say...
Yes,
I also say, sorry, so Alex, if I quickly
come back. Yes,
I also say that if we don't provide them with what they need, this wolf will indeed come to our door. It's coming to our door already, and it will come to our door more and more. So, I mean, my message is that, yes, we're giving Ukraine great support, but it's still not quick enough and in the quantities enough. I think if the world could do more like Britain is doing, then... and I spoke to senior Ukrainian military people only 2 weeks ago. I was out in Berlin.
Yeah.
And, that's the answer. More weapons quicker.
Yeah, indeed. Cormac, I couldn't agree more. And it's fantastic having you on and your expert insight into all of this and your common sense advice, former advisor to the Ukrainian Foreign Ministry there, Cormac Smith.